All right, let's go. Number 8. SAS Commandos. On October 18, 1942, Adolf Hitler issued a personal directive unlike anything in the established laws of war. The order was simple and absolute. Any Allied commando soldier captured behind enemy lines was to be executed immediately, without trial, without processing, without exception. It was a document later presented as evidence at the Nuremberg trials. It was also, unmistakably, a tribute. The Special Air Service had been founded just 14 months earlier, in July 1941, by Lieutenant David Sterling in the North African desert. The concept was methodical and radical in equal measure. Small units of 4 men inserted behind Axis lines, destroying aircraft, supply depots, and communication infrastructure before anyone knew they had arrived. Conventional military thinking had no framework for what Sterling was proposing. High command was skeptical. The results were undeniable. In their first year of operations, SAS units destroyed over 250 Axis aircraft on the ground, a figure that would climb past 400 by some operational estimates. German commanders filed reports describing the raids as terroristic in nature. When Sterling himself was captured in January 1943, Hitler placed him in maximum security detention, reportedly calling him the most dangerous British officer in the entire war. What unsettled both sides was the SAS's complete disregard for the boundaries that conventional soldiers operated within. They moved through spaces the military considered uncrossable, struck targets considered unreachable, and vanished before any response could be organized. Their own British command occasionally struggled to define what rules, if any, applied to them. The commando order was a war crime, prosecuted as such at Nuremberg. But it was also a measure of something else entirely. When your enemy rewrites the laws of war specifically to deal with you, that says everything about the kind of fear you have learned to generate. Number 7. Marine Raiders. In August 1942, a unit of United States Marines landed on Makin Atoll in the Central Pacific and killed every Japanese soldier present. When the fighting was over, their commanding officer issued direct orders to cease. Some of those orders were not immediately followed. The men doing the killing had simply not finished. The Marine Raiders were established on February 16, 1942, by order of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, partly at the direct insistence of his son, James Roosevelt, who would later serve within the unit. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson commanded the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, having spent time in China in 1937 personally observing communist guerrilla tactics. He returned with methods, a philosophy of small unit warfare, and a motto, gung-ho, borrowed from the Chinese industrial cooperative movement, meaning work together. What Carlson built was something that made senior Marine Corps commanders profoundly uncomfortable. General Alexander Van de Grift formally opposed the Raiders' existence, viewing them as a threat to the cohesion and culture of the broader Marine Corps. The concern was not their effectiveness. It was what they were becoming. Night infiltration, close quarters killing, operations explicitly designed to generate fear rather than simply defeat the enemy, these were methods that sat uneasily beside conventional military discipline. By February 1944, the Raiders had been dissolved and absorbed back into standard Marine units. The official reasoning cited operational efficiency. But the historical record suggests something more complicated. A recognition that the Raiders had internalized violence to a degree the institution found difficult to contain within its existing structures. The Marine Corps took them back into the ranks and moved on. But the men who served alongside them and the men who had fought against them carried the memory of what a unit looked like when it stopped thinking of itself as bound by normal limits. Number 6. Red Army Shock Troops. On the Eastern Front, there were Soviet soldiers who ran not toward the German lines, but away from the men positioned directly behind them. Those men were wearing the same uniform. They had orders to shoot anyone who retreated. They followed those orders. Stalin's reorganization of the Red Army following the catastrophic losses of 1941 produced the shock armies, formalized in December of that year. Units given priority weapons, rations, and vodka allocations, then deployed into the most heavily fortified positions as living battering rams. Order number 227, issued on July 28, 1942, and known throughout the Red Army as "Not One Step Back," made the system explicit. NKVD blocking detachments were to be positioned behind Soviet lines with a single mandate: shoot anyone who retreated without authorization. The men filling the shock units were not always volunteers. Many were convicts, political prisoners, and soldiers pulled from punishment assignments. At Stalingrad, which began in August 1942 and lasted until February 1943, shock troops cleared buildings, room by room, using grenades, flamethrowers, and bladed weapons when ammunition was exhausted. German accounts from that period describe encountering Soviet soldiers who appeared to have no functional sense of their own survival. Declassified Soviet military records, made partially available after 1991, indicate that blocking detachments killed approximately 158,000 of their own soldiers during the course of the war. That figure remains contested among historians, but it appears in Russian military historical publications, drawing on Soviet archive material. Regular soldiers stationed near shock units described avoiding proximity to them in camp, the association itself carrying a kind of contamination. If your own army positions armed men behind you with orders to execute you for retreating, the uniform stops meaning what a uniform is supposed to mean. The shock troops didn't just terrify the enemy. They existed inside a system that had made terror the fundamental operating principle, and everyone around them knew it. Number 5. Black shirts. In the early 1920s, Benito Mussolini's squadristi arrived at Italian towns that held the wrong political views, dragged local officials into the street, and force-fed them castor oil until their bodies gave out. The practice had a name: purgazione. It was not a fringe act committed by rogue elements. It was sanctioned policy, performed publicly, almost theatrically, as a demonstration of what organized political violence could accomplish when given permission to operate without consequence. The Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, the Blackshirts, was formally established on February 1, 1923, following Mussolini's march on Rome the previous October. Before that formalization, their squadrismo campaign between 1920 and 1922 had already destroyed dozens of Labor Federation offices, community centers, and opposition newspapers across northern Italy, while killing hundreds of political opponents. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were an instrument of systematic intimidation, given a uniform and a budget. What distinguished the Blackshirts from ordinary political thuggery was the scale of what came later. In Abyssinia, between 1935 and 1937, Blackshirt units participated in the deployment of mustard gas against civilian populations, confirmed by League of Nations investigators, and later corroborated by Italian military records. In February 1937, following an assassination attempt on Marshal Rodolfo Graziani in Addis Ababa, Blackshirt units conducted reprisal killings over 3 days that historians estimate cost between 3,000 and 30,000 civilian lives, a range that reflects both the ferocity of the event and the difficulty of documenting mass atrocity in a colonial context. By 1943, even within the fascist Grand Council, Blackshirt commanders were regarded as a liability. Their record had become diplomatically and strategically damaging. After Italy's armistice in September 1943, many units continued operating under German command or the Italian Social Republic, extending their record of violence into the final years of the war. The Blackshirts taught the rest of Europe's far right what political violence could look like when it was given a budget, a structure, and a government willing to look away. That lesson traveled, and it did not stay in Italy. Number 4. Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. In December 1944, in a snow-covered field near the Belgian town of Malmedy, 84 American prisoners of war were shot. They had surrendered. They were unarmed. The soldiers who killed them belonged to the 1st SS Panzer Division. the combat formation of the unit that had begun its existence as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard. The Malmedy Massacre became one of the most documented war crimes of the Western Front. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was formed in March 1933 under Sepp Dietrich, initially as an elite protection force defined by ideological purity and physical selection standards more rigorous than almost any other military unit in German history. They were meant to be the living embodiment of National Socialist ideals, fanatical in their commitment, ruthless in their discipline, and visible as a demonstration of the Reich's power. For a time, that is precisely what they were. The fracture point came early and kept recurring. At Wormhout in France on May 28, 1940, LSSAH soldiers herded British and French prisoners of war into a barn and killed them with grenades and gunfire, a massacre confirmed by British military investigations conducted after the war. At Boves in Italy in September 1943, the unit burned the town and killed 34 civilians in reprisal for partisan activity. Each incident generated Wehrmacht reports that expressed, in carefully bureaucratic language, something approaching alarm. Malmedy was the event that could not be contained. The subsequent U.S. Army investigation led to the Malmedy trial in 1946. Sepp Dietrich received a 25-year sentence. Joachim Peiper, the operational commander at Malmedy, received a death sentence that was later commuted. Wehrmacht generals, including Erich von Manstein, had recorded private objections to LSSAH conduct in occupied territories long before the trial. A unit created to embody an ideology's highest ideals ended up generating war crimes documentation that would be cited at Nuremberg. The distance between those two facts is not a mystery. It is what happens when an institution builds a unit around the idea that its members exist above ordinary limits. Number 3. NKVD penal battalions. In the Soviet military during the Second World War, there was an assignment worse than being sent to the front. It was being sent to the front inside a Strafbat, a penal battalion where the men behind you were not your comrades but your jailers, and the only recognized routes out were through the German lines or into the ground. Stalin's Order No. 227, issued July 28, 1942, created the formal framework for what had already been operating informally. Penal battalions were filled with soldiers convicted of cowardice or unauthorized retreat, officers who had failed in their commands, political prisoners extracted from the Gulag system, and convicted criminals given the choice between a cell and a battlefield. NKVD blocking detachments were positioned behind them with orders to shoot anyone who retreated, surrendered, or attempted to move laterally out of the advance. The system was not improvised. It was methodical, documented, and administered. The assignments given to penal units reflected their expendable status with cold precision. They were used for mine clearance by advancing on foot through minefields. They were deployed into positions so heavily fortified that casualty rates in individual engagements exceeded 50%. Soviet military historians, working from records made partially available after 1991, estimate that approximately 422,000 soldiers passed through Strafbat assignments across the course of the war. A significant proportion did not complete their sentence by surviving it. NKVD commanders of penal units held judicial authority over the men under their command, including the power to execute for insubordination on the spot without a court-martial. Regular Soviet soldiers stationed near penal units described a specific kind of dread that came not from the men themselves, but from what their presence signified: the proximity of a system that had decided some lives were currency to be spent. The Strafbat was the Soviet state's answer to the problem of men it did not trust but still needed. It sent them to places where death was nearly certain and called the arrangement a sentence being served. There is no more precise definition of expendable. Number 2. Japanese Imperial Army, Unit 731. Between 1937 and 1945, in a facility outside the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, military scientists conducted experiments on living human beings. The subjects were referred to in official documentation as Maruta, the Japanese word for logs. The facility was not a rogue operation hidden from command. It was funded, directed, and classified by the Imperial Japanese Army at the highest levels of its institutional structure. Unit 731 operated under the formal cover name of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Its actual commander was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a military physician who had lobbied the Imperial Army for years to develop biological weapons as a strategic asset. The facility at Pingfang covered 6 square kilometers and employed more than 3,000 personnel at its operational peak. Its subjects included Chinese civilians, Korean prisoners, Russian detainees, and Allied prisoners of war. The documented experiments included vivisection performed without anesthetic, deliberate infection with plague, cholera, and typhoid to study the progression of disease in living subjects, frostbite experiments conducted by exposing limbs to extreme cold until they could be broken off, and pressure chamber testing to determine how rapidly the human body collapsed under atmospheric extremes. Estimated death tolls from Unit 731 operations range between 3,000 and 12,000 confirmed victims, with some historical estimates reaching higher. The uncertainty in the figures is itself a product of the thoroughness with which records were destroyed in August 1945. In 1949, the Soviet Union tried 12 Unit 731 personnel at the Khabarovsk war crimes trial. The United States government granted immunity to Ishii and his senior researchers in exchange for their experimental data, an arrangement that remained classified and was confirmed only by declassified American documents made available in the 1990s. The Japanese government did not officially acknowledge Unit 731's activities until 1997, more than 50 years after the war ended. The victims of Unit 731 were killed twice. Once in the facility at Pingfang, and once when the governments that won the war decided that the data extracted from their deaths was worth more than the prosecutions that justice required. That calculation has never been adequately answered for. Number 1. The Dirlewanger Brigade. In the summer of 1944, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler received formal written complaints about a unit operating under his command. The complaints came from other SS generals. The charges included mass murder of civilians, systematic looting, and conduct described in official SS documentation as beyond military necessity. Himmler reviewed the complaints. He then deployed the unit again. The Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, later reorganized as the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, was founded in 1940 by Oskar Dirlewanger, a man who had served a prison sentence before the war for the sexual assault of a minor. The unit was recruited not from ideologically committed volunteers, but from convicted criminals, poachers initially, then expanded to include murderers, rapists, and inmates pulled directly from concentration camps. This was not an accident of circumstance. It was the deliberate design of an institution that needed men willing to do things it could not ask of ordinary soldiers. During anti-partisan operations in Belorussia between 1941 and 1944, the brigade developed a documented methodology. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were surrounded. The population was locked inside structures, and those structures were burned. The tactic appears repeatedly in Wehrmacht and SS after-action reports from the region, recorded with the bureaucratic neutrality of units filing standard operational summaries. In August and September 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, Dirlewanger's forces entered the Wola district of the city and killed an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 civilians in a single week. The figure comes from German military records and survivor testimony presented at Nuremberg. SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who commanded broader anti-partisan operations in the region, formally recorded in official documentation that Dirlewanger's unit was out of control. Read that again. A senior SS general, a man who oversaw some of the most savage counterinsurgency campaigns in the history of the Eastern Front, filed a formal complaint stating that this unit had exceeded acceptable limits. Within a military and ideological system that had sanctioned the industrial murder of millions, the Dirlewanger Brigade managed to generate paperwork expressing institutional embarrassment. Oskar Dirlewanger was captured by French forces in June 1945 and died in detention, beaten by Polish guards at a facility in Altshausen. He was never tried. Many of his officers similarly evaded formal prosecution. The brigade's casualty replacement rate had run at nearly 100% multiple times across its operational history. Men consumed and replaced with more convicts in a continuous cycle, the institution feeding itself with the worst it could find and pointing them at whatever it needed destroyed. The Dirlewanger Brigade is not a story about war making men into monsters. It is a story about a state that went looking for monsters, found them, armed them, and then had the audacity to file a complaint when the monsters behaved exactly as designed. What it leaves behind is not a mystery to be solved, but a truth to be faced. When an institution decides that some acts are necessary but cannot be performed by ordinary people, it does not thereby place those acts outside itself. It simply reveals what it was always willing to become. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.